Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. So for those of you who haven't heard yet, all three of you there in the back, the famous children's books by Roald Dahl have a new edition coming from Puffin Press, and they have been updated for modern audiences. Joy, joy. Well, I am not here to talk about why the edits are glaring or why I am highly offended by them. Yes, I do find them to be extremely clunky, and more on that in a minute, but what I find fascinating about this is what has happened to Roald Dahl is something that used to be a very integral part of our storytelling tradition, and it is only now in the modern era that it strikes us as crazy or immoral. The Dahl story arc is very fascinating because it shows both how our storytelling has progressed and how it has regressed, and it shows both of these things from a number of angles. So what do I mean? Well, in the past, the Western storytelling tradition was really founded by the Greeks. Yes, Western culture draws as heavily from Judeo-Christian storytelling traditions as does the Greek ones, but the Judeo-Christian storytelling traditions are rooted in an attempt to preserve religious doctrine and what is viewed as historical events from our point of view. And so they are not quite the same as the Greek storytelling tradition, which is rooted in an understanding of what we now call fiction, although the Greeks did not necessarily refer to it as such in their time. The Greek tradition is rooted in the great poets, people like Homer and Virgil, people who told great stories about mythological figures, but who were not necessarily creating those stories on their own. They were really more curators, people who learned their stories at the feet of others and then told them to other people as they traveled around the countryside. These people were traveling entertainers, much like the later medieval bards, not so much writers who were creating the stories on their own. Obviously, for these stories, there is some originating point, possibly even historical events. But it was generally understood that we were not telling the historical events, we were telling a story built around them. The Iliad may be the first case of historical fiction, created and intended as such, that we know of. From what we can tell about these great poetic works, they were handed down from one teller to another who continuously modified them. This is why, of the over 2,000 versions of the Iliad that we have on hand, there are several different potential lengths that we could give to the final epic poem. Yes, there is a agreed upon, most commonly used version of the original text, but there are many different versions of the text. That's just historical fact. And these different versions come along because people were constantly tinkering with the poem and trying out different things. The other branch of the Greco-Roman storytelling tradition is the great plays. Two good examples of these are Oedipus Rex and Prometheus. Of course, plays have scripts to work off of, and it is the surviving copies of these scripts that give us an idea of what Greek plays were like. However, Greek plays also were changed in the way they were performed. What I mean by this is that sometimes you just had to end a play early. If the crowd got rowdy, they would lower a box down onto the stage, and the gods would come out of it and quickly end the play so that the actors could get off the stage and not be pelted to death by projectiles from the audience. Yes, that happened, even back then. But more than that, part of the magic of live entertainment is that it is a little bit different every time. People forget lines, or they switch around their order, or a new actor gets cast and they bring a different interpretation to the character, or they are performing on a different stage than they are used to, and the blocking must be changed. These are all things that can happen in live theater even today. Even though we don't lower boxes down onto the stage and end things via deus ex machina, there are any number of potential outcomes to live storytelling. Both the poetical and the theatrical schools of storytelling have a couple of things in common about them. First, they were a little bit flexible. Yes, there was an emphasis on recreating the work as faithfully as you could, but everyone recognized that it was not always possible to be pitch perfect. Sometimes you slipped up, sometimes you made mistakes, and sometimes the spirit of the occasion moved you and you just spontaneously made a change that seemed appropriate to the moment. Improvisation and experimentation are more accepted in these kind of live moments than they are today with our very static mediums of communication. And sometimes these improvisations would just stick around. People would really enjoy them, and they would continue to repeat them over time. This is why we get different versions of manuscripts in fiction in particular. Not as much in historical documents or religious documents that had a certain amount of accuracy expected of them. The second thing these traditions had in common is that you joined them as an apprentice. You did not begin doing your own thing. You were put under the tutelage of a more experienced storyteller who would help you to work out the kinks in your performances. Whether you were a poet following your master around and learning and reciting his stories with him to help you memorize the stories themselves and learn the ways audience best reacted to them, or you are an actor studying under another actor who was very familiar with the role already and could help you figure out the most important parts of that role, as well as practice the lines with you and give some insight into what your character is thinking and doing. If you were a part of these ancient Greek storytelling traditions, you did not begin as a full-fledged storyteller. In the modern writer's market, there is just no role comparable to this. The closest might be starting your career as someone who adapts stories from one medium to another. In that case, you have an established story that already exists, and the person can dig into the guts of it and try and figure out what makes it work and how to best translate those elements to a different medium. You might also begin in writing fan fiction, creating stories based on other people's characters and situations that you yourself are just adding onto. What does not exist for the modern writer is an area where you can take a story, tweak it a little bit, and retell it in your own prose, and then get feedback from a person who has also told that story before. If you do that, you tend to run afoul of being called unoriginal or unthinking. And I don't think that's entirely charitable. In fact, I think that kind of exercise can be very useful for the writer to stretch their wings and grow. What I don't think should be done with that kind of an exercise is I don't think it should replace an existing work of fiction. And that was definitely at least the original intention of these Roald Dahl edits. Now, it has been announced that an original, unedited version of these stories will still be available, which is a good decision that I think has been brought about entirely because there was a strong backlash to the edits themselves. But one of the things that upsets me the most about this is there is a universal objection to taking the stories of a great storyteller and attempting to retell them in your own words. This is viewed as some kind of great travesty, that they have taken the works of this brilliant man, Roald Dahl, and they have taken his stories and they have told them in their own words, and isn't that terrible? No. That was the original way that people learned the art of storytelling, certainly in the Western tradition, and probably everywhere in the world. Storytelling is just like carpentry. It is a trade, a craft that you learn at the feet of better men than yourself. If you want to build a chair, you study with a carpenter who knows how to build a chair. You watch him build that chair, and then you try and build that chair. Of course, the first chair that an apprentice carpenter builds will look nothing like the chair of a master carpenter. And once the apprentice is a master carpenter, they may not choose to build chairs anything like the chairs their master built either. But at the beginning, mimicking the carpentry of another is the best way to learn the trade. And the same is true of storytelling. There are, of course, other ways to learn both of these skills, including starting from scratch yourself. However, choosing the tried and true way is in no way a mistake or a moral failing. Rather, we run into hurdles with things like copyright law, or allowing the work of others to become a crutch that makes you a lazy and derivative storyteller. What is important in these cases is that you clearly give the pedigree of your story. If you are riffing on someone else's story, it is important to make that clear, rather than try to claim the story for yourself. This creates an opportunity for your audience to engage with the story in its totality. Rather than just reading your version of the story, they may be inspired to go back and look at the source material that you are attempting to emulate. And then they can sketch the arc of the story circle forward through the successive iterations of the story and gain a deeper appreciation of the art of storytelling just by examining the differences and gaining an appreciation of how these differences compound through the course of a story, which they always will. Now, while I think this kind of iterative storytelling is an important part of learning the craft of storytelling, this doesn't actually apply to what happened in the Roald Dahl edits. We know why these edits were done, and it was not as an exercise in storytelling or in understanding the craft. It was done by sensitivity readers who are attempting to update the story. In Dante's Divine Comedy, there is a line where a character lifts up his hands towards God and he makes figs. Many bizarre and supernatural things happen in Dante's Divine Comedy, so we might choose to interpret this line to refer to the actual physical creation of figs. Much stranger things have happened up until the point of this line and continue to occur after this line. So that is a reasonable reading of the line. The problem is that in Dante's Italy, making figs referred to an obscene gesture where the fists were clenched and shaken in a way that was supposed to be reminiscent of a man's testicles. The man was condemned to hell, and he was suffering and insulting God in his suffering. That is a piece of important cultural context which very few people will understand. In fact, I myself only understand it because in the translation of Dante's Divine Comedy that I read when I was in high school, there was a footnote that pointed this out. So, what is the best way to make sure these small, very opaque details are intelligible to modern audiences as they read the story? Well, you might choose to put in a footnote. Clearly that worked for me, but not everyone reads footnotes as they make their way through a piece. So perhaps you could try to adapt the line and make it clear that rather than literally making figs, the character in question is making an obscene gesture. You could describe the gesture and what it is intended to symbolize. Or you might choose to replace it with a reference to a modern obscene gesture. You might say he held up his middle fingers, or you might say he threw the bird, which is a very poetic and polite way to refer to this gesture, just as making figs was a polite way to refer to the old gesture in Dante's Italy. There is no one ironclad way to translate these very archaic sayings for modern audiences. It is as much art, part of the art of storytelling, as it is a scientific comparison of the exact meanings of words. There is a meaning and a significance in experimenting with these different methodologies and debating whether they bring Dante's meaning most clearly to an intended audience. With all that said, that is not what Puffin Press was trying to do when they updated Roald Dahl's books. What they were trying to do was obscure Roald Dahl's original meaning. Consider the following edit. In The Witches, Roald Dahl writes, "You can't go round pulling the hair of every lady you meet, even if she is wearing gloves. Just you try it and see what happens." The new version of this reads, "Besides, there are plenty of other reasons why women might wear wigs, and there is certainly nothing wrong with that." Now, in the witches are all bald, and they wear wigs to hide this fact. Dahl's original lines are intended to point out that even if people could be hiding some sinister secret, you can't just go around tormenting them about it to make sure they have no secrets to hide. You have to show more consideration than that. This is an important lesson on getting along with others. This lesson is entirely lost in the new version of the story, which simply says that people could wear wigs for any number of reasons. It doesn't say anything about your behavior. It takes the onus off of the reader and places it on other people. That very clearly and very distinctly obscures the message that Roald Dahl was trying to communicate, which is why we know that these edits are not intended simply to update things for modern audiences. They are actively trying to obscure the message that Roald Dahl wanted to communicate. Updating a message makes it more clear for modern audiences and creates very interesting discussions around iterative storytelling. What Puffin Press has done is the exact opposite. they have tried to hide from the original message and obscure any discussion on iterative storytelling. That is clearly bad. I am not an expert on the works of Roald Dahl. I don't have a powerful childhood connection to them like many people do, but I can clearly see just from the small context that I have around this excerpt from The Witches, to say nothing of some of the edits they've made to Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, a story I am more familiar with, that the purpose here is not to improve the craft or to make the messages clearer to modern audiences. That said, the discussion around these changes disappoints me because it so clearly ignores elements of the art of storytelling that our culture has been neglecting. And we have been neglecting them because we no longer participate in iterative storytelling as a culture. Storytellers are the only ones who are expected to deal with iteration in storytelling. This was not the case when our story circle was intact and healthy. It was not the case when everyone took part in iterating stories. Before the written word, before audio recording, before video recording, everyone had a little bit of skin in the storytelling game. When you heard a great story, you had to be the one to tell it to other people. You couldn't rely on somebody coming through town again able to tell that story. Or maybe you were the only one who saw the events from your community. You had to be the one who told the story to other people. You had to understand the art of storytelling in order to get those messages across. Now, in the age of semi-permanent media, we become very attached to a specific iteration of a story, and we become very upset when we see any change to it. We don't interrogate the question, why has the change taken place? Is it meaningful? Is it important? We're not even equipped to ask those questions because we have never iterated on stories ourselves in most cases. So when something like the Roald Dahl fiasco takes place, we are poorly equipped to comment on what is actually happening here. We can only speak in very broad generalities of agendas, of politics. We can't look at the very specific things that have happened in the story and say, it's wrong because of this. It is wrong because Roald Dahl was trying to inspire in his audience a sense of personal restraint and personal responsibility that these edits then take away from the audience. And we can't do that because as a society and as a culture, we are narratively illiterate. We are narratively illiterate because we have become complacent. The real reason I think people are so upset about the Roald Dahl edits are because it's a reminder that the stories you love die a little every day. They become less fresh, they become less relevant, they become less immediate. And even if you go back and you re-experience that story word for word, your mind brings with it biases based on your previous experiences of the story that make it very hard to register other aspects of the story. If you've ever been in a book club and had a book you've read a dozen times come up in the rotation of what you read, you will discover people that find things you never even thought about because you had gotten so used to reading that story, you just glossed over them. The best way to keep stories alive and fresh in your mind is to become a teller of those stories, is to inhabit them on the structural level and say, I am prepared to tell this story myself. Once you are ready to do that, once you take your place in the story circle, you will be a part of the living memory of that story. And that is the best thing you can do to keep it alive. You can't count on the original authors, believe it or not. They will often mess with their own work in order to bring it more in line with their views of the moment. That is just what artists do. They are living people, and their artistic vision is also a living thing. Ask George Lucas about that sometime. You cannot count on publishers to do it because they are driven by markets. Markets don't know what they want until they find it. And so publishers and other businessmen are always tinkering with things in the hope that the market will find it to be something they like. And finally, you cannot count on physical media. I know those people are out there who tell you own physical media. This will protect your stories. That's wrong. I'm sorry, houses burn down, buildings flood, works are lost. Yes, there are physical books and copies of stories all over the place in the world. And there will probably never be a time when an existing story is completely annihilated through disaster or accident. But that doesn't mean that you will be able to get your hands on that physical copy. You can only guarantee that the story will always be available to you when you are prepared to tell that story yourself. That's part of the power and magic of the story circle, and that is the only way you can keep hold of what is most important to you. Anyway, that's all I got for you today. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. There's a like button and a subscribe button down there. You can use those as you see fit, and I'll talk to you later.